All right, so welcome to the webinar on how to tell that a person has a disability. One of the things that I hear a lot from employers is who counts as a person with a disability? And they tend to ask several follow-up questions like, can I ask a candidate, employee, or coworker if they have a disability? And what should I do if somebody does disclose a disability to me? And then my favorite one, which is from the employee's point of view, why should I disclose my disability to my employer? These tend to be the big um, questions, the big elephant in the room related to disclosure and being able to tell whether somebody has a disability. So we're going to talk about that today. A couple of quick things. This webinar is being recorded so that a replay can be made available to everybody who could not attend live. We do want your interaction, so we want you to use the chat and QA and hand raising. And just in case you're not familiar, to use the chat, you want to select the icon that looks like a little speech bubble. It'll open up a window. You're going to select everyone if you want everyone to see what you're going to type, or you can just pick one of the people that's attending this. And I prefer that you put everyone so everyone can benefit from those questions, but it can be private as well. You can also raise your hand using the reactions button. It looks like a little smiley face. And when you click on that, you get a little menu. At the bottom of that menu, it says raise your hand. If you click on that, we will know you're raising your hand. And then Lisa will be able to call on you and we'll get your question answered. And once your question has been answered, then you can lower your hand. So I'm going to talk about my objectives today for a second, which is what is disability disclosure and disability self-identification? And I'm going to talk about the difference between them. Self-identification is also called self-ID. We're going to talk about why it's important, but I hope the bulk of this will be about how to facilitate this. But what is your objective? I'd love if you would type into the chat whether you want to know about the what is disability disclosure, or the why is this important, or the how to facilitate it. So if you want to type in the chat real quick, and we'll get going with people's input. While people are voting on this, I just want to give you a reminder that this is being recorded. It's really exciting to have the opportunity to record this. You can catch the replay later, so you don't have to take a ton of notes. Feel free to take screenshots of the slides as we go. And the replay will be emailed to you later after I get it captioned. I like to verify the transcription of the caption, so sometimes it can take me a day or two to get that all done and set up and emailed off to you, but it will be available very quickly afterwards for you and for those who are unable to attend this live. Also, I want to acknowledge my co-host, Lisa, who is here from Human Service Forum, and she has been, they've been such a wonderful partner for this webinar. I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to work with them. They just take all of my woes away and my troubles away of trying to coordinate and run a webinar while being the presenter at the same time. So thank you, Lisa, very much for being here. I really appreciate everything that you and your team do to help me bring this content to folks. Is there anything in the chat about votes for what objectives they'd like to hear?
Yes, so ideally we'd like to hear about all three, but I know for me personally, primarily what and how are the two big ones for me.
Okay, great. Then we will move on. What people sometimes ask me is, how do you know this, Deb? So I like to give a little background on why I'm providing this and why I think that the content's valid. So I created this, and this is Walgreens. Walgreens hired me in 2006, and I was there for 7 years to help them figure out how to employ people with disabilities and be an employer that's disability friendly. We did this within the context of making sure that every move we made, every change we made, was fair to the customers, the employees, and the shareholders alike. So we took cost into consideration. We took how we were changing systems, what sorts of things we were doing, took all that into consideration. We started with the distribution centers, which is why my top photos from the distribution center. And then after we had figured out how to influence the systems within the company, we moved over to retail and determined what would be a really successful way to incorporate people with disabilities into the workforce in retail, which was very different than in the distribution centers. And then after that, we worked with the corporate headquarters folks on how do we do this for everybody else who works for Walgreens, because it's not just the store employees and it's not just the distribution center employees. And so we did a great job. Our goal was that 1,000 people, well, I should say that our goal was 1,000, but the lawyers wanted us to say that the goal was 10% of the workforce would be people with disabilities in supply chain. And we achieved that goal in 2011. And the goal for the retail side of the company was that 10% of new hires would be individuals who had gone through the training program specifically designed to help people with disabilities get the skills they needed to be successful in the stores. And by the time I left, we had achieved both of those goals, and I was very proud of that. It was really a labor of love to be able to take a company, a very old company and a very established company, and help them think about diversity in a very different dimension. So that was what I got to do at Walgreens. And then since leaving Walgreens, I've helped more than 100 companies employ people with disabilities. And so it's through that experience that I provide the information in these webinars, what other companies have encountered, where they've struggled, where they've had success, and I try to bring that to the audience. So let's hop into the topics. Today, we are talking about disability disclosure and self-ID, because the question I get is, how do I know if somebody has a disability? Or how do I know if I'm successful in trying to employ more people with disabilities? And so these are key things. To start off with, terminology is important. Self-identification and self-ID to me are interchangeable terms. So if you hear me using one or the other, I mean both. And the other one is disclosure versus disability disclosure. And in that case, I use those interchangeably as well. So they are two different things, and I'll talk about that in a second. But just so that you know, when I say self-ID, I mean self-identification. And when I say disclosure, I do mean disability disclosure. So let's talk about self-ID first. Self-identification is a very new concept. It started in 2014, and it is now for any company that is a federal contractor in the US, which is, I don't know the number off the top of my head, thousands, tens of thousands of companies are federal contractors. They are required to ask applicants or to offer the opportunity to applicants to voluntarily self-identify as a person with a disability. And the form, if you can see it on the screen, it's got a lot of very small print. It's very text heavy, and it reads through like the government wrote the form. It starts out explaining why the form is being asked, why the applicant is being asked to complete the form. And then it says that completing the form is voluntary, that it will be kept, the information will be kept private. Then they go on to some more, it won't be held against you. And then they give examples of disability and offer somebody the opportunity to either say, yes, I have a disability, or previously had one. No, I don't have a disability, or I don't wish to answer. And then you add your name. This has been incorporated into electronic applications now. So it looks just like this, but it's not a piece of paper anymore. And I think it's key to realize that, well, there's several things to think about this, but this is a very text-heavy form. I recently, as a test for one of my clients, completed an application online, and I didn't even want to read the form. And I knew why they were asking, and I really want to help their data sets, but it's just, as you're going through filling out an application, it's very cumbersome to complete this form. So if you are an employer, just know that this is a challenge for a lot of people to read this form all the way through, understand what the question is, and answer it. So they're going to typically self-select, I don't want to answer, so they can get through the application. If you are somebody who helps people with disabilities apply for jobs, you may want to coach them on how to answer this question and why it's being asked, and so that they understand the full value. Because in an ideal world, we do want everybody to answer this question so we understand how successful companies are in trying to employ people with disabilities. But this is a very lumpy way to ask, very cumbersome. So let's talk about disability disclosure and self-ID for a second. The question of self-identification is asking you to talk about your disability. And disability is an incredibly heavy legal topic. It's protected information. It makes people worry. When people hear the question or see the question, do you have a disability? It's very intimidating. It's stressful. Why would I want to tell you that? The explanation provided in the self ID form is not helpful. I don't find it helpful. I don't think that they really do a good job of explaining in a user friendly way why somebody would want to provide that information. And again, this is very personal information and it's legal information. It's protected. How did we get here? So, there were several pieces of legislation and other milestones that happened along the way. We start with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So in 1990, the US made it illegal to discriminate against people based on the fact that they had a disability or they were assumed to have a disability or they had a history of having a disability. So for people who were employees or applying for jobs prior to 1990, it was not illegal across the US to discriminate. Now, some states had this components already in there, but looking at this from a big picture perspective, 1990, so 31 years ago, is when it became illegal for companies to discriminate against people with disabilities. So during that time, it was a wonderful time to celebrate as people with disabilities and as advocates for people with disabilities, but all of a sudden employers got very concerned. What if somebody thinks I'm discriminating against them and I'm not? And it became a very big topic across human resources and leaders within companies about how to manage the information. And most of the information was decided to be when the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which we call HIPAA, came to be in 1996. Disability became health information, and that became the excuse for why companies didn't want to know if somebody had a disability. They didn't want to ask that question. They didn't want anybody to volunteer that information unless they absolutely had to. And attorneys within companies were advising, just don't keep this information anywhere. If you do, keep it someplace separate. It's very special. It's very different. It became a very big topic, a very interesting topic that people got very concerned with. In 2012, Walgreens published their first business case, all the data about how successful as a company they were, not just in employing people with disabilities, but how much that assisted in the bottom line, where we found cost savings by employing more people with disabilities, where we found advantages by employing more people with disabilities through production and safety and things like that. And so all of a sudden, businesses were very interested in people with disabilities. But remember, in the history, they had these warnings from attorneys saying, you don't want to know, you don't want to know. So during that time, disability disclosure was what was happening. If a person chose to disclose that they had a disability, then they did. And then the companies or the attorneys or whomever was concerned about, how do I keep this information? And then in 2014, the US contractors are required to self-ID and have the self-ID form exactly the way I showed it to you in the previous slide. We'll go to it again. And ask the question exactly the way they've said, and to do it in a very prescribed way. And it's not just for applicants. Now, federal contractors are required to ask employees at least every 5 years if they are a person who wants to identify as a person with a disability. They get the choice to uncheck the box or to check the box. It's kind of an awkward thing to watch. But the biggest thing about the self-ID now covering over disability disclosure was that companies that had previously been keeping data on disability, like Walgreens, saw a drop in their self-ID rates. All of a sudden, they didn't have as many people with disabilities as they used to, but they hadn't lost any of those employees. So people demonstrated that the way the question was now being asked was prompting them to say, I'm not a person with a disability, or I don't want to answer the question. People were no longer affirmatively saying, I'm a person with a disability. And in 2018, the labor crisis really played a part in what was happening, because every company was looking for new sources for labor. And so people with disabilities became a very attractive opportunity for hiring. But the idea of the disability and all of the baggage that comes with the idea that you shouldn't know that somebody has a disability, you're opening yourself up to opportunities for discrimination lawsuits, and then the federal contractor self-ID layer on top of that just made this topic incredibly complex. In addition to that, we are now relying on our employees and our applicants to apply. And I don't know about the rest of you, but when somebody asks me if I have a disability, I want to know what's in it for me. Why should I give you this information? Why, how is it any of your business? This is my health information, whatever my reaction is. What I want to know is, where am I going to get a benefit in this? And the self ID process has definitely eliminated the opportunity to give somebody that response right when you're asking the question. At Walgreens, before federal contractor requirements, this was how we asked the question. And we did ask the question a lot. We said, hey there, we're trying to make our workplaces more inclusive of people with disabilities because we believe it makes our workplace better. So it would really help us learn if our efforts are working if you'll tell us whether or not you have a disability. The information that you provide us will only be seen by the disability inclusion manager, and we're using it to track our results and will not be shared with anybody else. If you want your manager to know that you have a disability, you are welcome to share that with him or her yourself. And that kind of presentation of the question, do you have a disability, along with our well advertised efforts to employ more people with disabilities, gave us a very high level of people saying, yes, I'm a person with a disability. In fact, they would then go on to tell us about their disability. And in the places where we saw at least 30% of the workforce consisting of people who had told us that they had a disability, when you went to those places, what you realized was that if you didn't have a disability, or you didn't identify or act like you had a disability, you actually you felt like you were in the minority. You felt like you stuck out like a sore thumb because it was so well accepted. It was so just part of how it was. You know, if you're a person with a disability, you're also a blonde, 5'2" woman, white woman. That was my descriptor. It just fits in with everything else. It wasn't this very special or different component of being a person. So self-ID really changed disability disclosure. Using that required process and the wording and the form, it had a significant impact. And it wasn't just Walgreens that saw a drop in their statistics about how many employees with disabilities they had. And again, that drop did not happen because they were no longer employing those people with disabilities. It was because those people were no longer comfortable answering the question. So businesses who had a great measurement, understanding who was there, saw these lower numbers and started to question whether it had to do with how they were employing people or whether it was just about how the question was being asked. And unfortunately, we have enough years passed now. It's been 6-7 years now since that requirement came in. So we can see what the data looked like before then and what the data looks like now. But that has not convinced the government to change the way that they require federal contractors to ask this question. And it doesn't seem to change the fact that people with disabilities feel this is very sensitive information, and they're not interested in answering that question as much anymore. The perspective about that, I think, is incredibly important. When you're asking somebody to disclose, you get them to say, I have a disability. It's a very affirmative experience. When you're asking about self-ID, you are saying, and it's almost with a stern tone, do you have a disability? That's how I read that form. And many of the people I know with disabilities who have applied for jobs or are current employees, that's how they read the form. So the form itself is an issue, but we'll just go into talking about how to get individuals disclosing or self-identifying as people with disabilities. And when we're talking about disclosure, just as a bigger topic, not as self-ID, which is the mandated part for federal contractors, one of the things to think about, not just having your employees who have a disability to disclose or to feel comfortable disclosing, but also think about, are your other employees, their colleagues, are they prepared to have somebody say, hey, you know what, I have a disability? People's responses, the coworker's response when I say I have a disability, really to me is indicative of the culture in the workplace. So if my disability becomes public and a lot of the reaction from the workforce is, oh no, this is terrible, oh, this is such a tragedy, these very, very negative connotation responses, it's an indication of the culture in that workplace. And as a person with a disability, it's not going to make me want to stay. Whereas if the colleagues say, oh, they have a very caring response. They say, thank you for sharing. They demonstrate empathy and openness about it. They may not know what it means or exactly, but their response is a more positive or at least neutral opportunity or feeling. Then that's also reflective of the culture of the workplace. So just thinking about it from that perspective, it's not just about driving data for the federal contractor, for the feds, because you're a contractor. It's also about just what's happening in your workforce and how inclusive is it. So let's talk about why it's important. It's a big deal. It's a huge deal. It was a big deal at Walgreens before federal contractor status happened, and it's a big deal now. It's a big deal because people want to know what's in it for them. Where are the benefits in this? I think that a lot of people forget about the fact that the company's going to get benefits, like I described in the January webinar. All of the benefits that companies experience by employing more people with disabilities is the company's benefits. But what's the benefit for the individual who's providing that information? It's confusing to the employee or the applicant. There's a very lack of clarity because of the legal framework of that question and the way it's asked. It doesn't feel like a good thing to do. It doesn't feel like good information to provide. And they say in there, if you read it, that it has nothing to do with whether you're going to get the job or not. So why would people share the information? I think that that's been the hardest part, watching this as an advocate for people with disabilities, but also an advocate for employers who want to employ people with disabilities, is this lack of clarity about what does this question mean and why are we asking it? And why would somebody want to answer it? Protecting disability information is really important. And I don't feel like that form, the way it's provided, really gives somebody a feeling about who really needs to know about my disability status. Because if you're a person with a disability and you need accommodations, you already know you're going to have that conversation with your manager and with the human resources folks. This form isn't helping you get what you need as an employee, disclosing your disability. And so it can be very challenging. And it doesn't help managers who now have to protect disability disclosure information that they've received, because they don't see that form. They don't know who has a disability. So the whole idea of protecting disability information makes it very confusing. And honestly, the whole topic of disability makes people uncomfortable. Unfortunately, society is such that we still have many people who think negative thoughts when they think about disability, or they have an unfortunate negative impression of people who have disabilities, at least disabilities they can see or that they know of. This stigma persists, and we're working hard to help combat it. But at the time, even now, it still makes people uncomfortable to talk about disability or to relate to people with disabilities. They feel like they're not sure what they're supposed to do. We already did a webinar on that topic, so I won't go into it right now. But it's still a very tricky topic for people. But we're all in the same boat. As employers, we all have this barrier. If we're all federal contractors, we have this requirement to have that question in our applicant tracking system, as well as asking our employees at least every 5 years, and trying to figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't feel as sterile as that form comes off as, and doesn't feel as compliance driven as those forms present. So let's get to the fun part. Let's talk about how to facilitate self-identification and disability disclosure. And I think about this across the terms, the perspectives of employees, colleagues, and managers, bosses, leaders, people like that, who may not be directly dealing with the person with a disability, but in aggregate are thinking about their employees with disabilities. So the first thing to do is to create clarity. I think it's so important that we explain and over-explain why we're doing this. Why are we asking this question? Why do we as a business care about whether or not an employee or applicant has a disability? Obviously, we want to make sure people are not encountering barriers related to their disability that's preventing them from providing their talents to us, or from being able to have the opportunities that our businesses can offer. So the clarity can be very important. Part of that clarity is not really knowing who is a person with a disability. So a question I get all the time, and you all know this because you've listened to me before, who counts as a person with a disability? I now just I refer people to the quiz that I have on my website. Just go to the quiz. It'll answer the question for you better than I can. But we can also fall back onto the Americans with Disabilities Act definition of disability, which is a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. But when we're talking to our applicants and to our workforce about asking them to identify or self-ID as a person with a disability, we want to let them know what that means. We had a very cool experience at Walgreens, which I'll talk about in a second, and how we define disability for a while. But keep in mind that just because the Americans with Disabilities Act is the most used definition of disability, there are about 50 other definitions of disability because it depends why you are looking at disability. So just for example, the Social Security Administration has a different definition of disability. The veterans have a very different definition of disability, and special education has a third and different definition of disability, as do many other governmental programs. Anything that requires you to have a disability to be eligible for it, they're defining disability, and not all in the same way. So again, disabilities is a very cloudy topic that's just got a lot of components to it that make it pretty interesting to study, but challenging to have one or to be wanting to recruit people with disabilities. So consistent communication. So I talked about clarity. Now let's talk about consistent communication. I think we all know that you tell somebody something once, they don't remember it. If you are a mom, you know for sure your kids don't listen to you the first time you say something and tell them to do something. You have to say it several times. But that's actually true of everybody, not just your children. We need to hear information over and over again to gain the familiarity with it, to process it, to figure out what it means, how it works. So consistent communication is important when you're trying to get employees to disclose that they have a disability, or to self-identify as a person with a disability, to make sure not just that it's often that you are communicating this, but that you're giving them the same message every time, that you want them to disclose their disability because you welcome them as employees with disabilities coming into your workforce, that this is something that is a positive experience. So every time you as a company are talking about employing people with disabilities, you need to have woven through that the idea that it's a positive thing to talk about disability. Again, here's that form. I want to rip the form out of every time I see it. I want to rip it off the screen right now. It's so frustrating. The wording they use, the impression from a visual standpoint of the form, not to mention just how it sounds if you read it out loud, is just not very friendly. So clarifying around the form. If you have to use this form, provide the clarity, communicate well to people, cushion it as you will. And that's how we did things at Walgreens. When we said, are you a person with a disability? We started out saying, hey, we want to employ more people with disabilities. And we're working hard to become a very disability inclusive environment. We want our company to be deemed as an employer of choice. And so we would love this information. And this is how this information is relevant to us and what we're going to do with it. And we really want this to be a great experience. So we provided that clarity of why we were asking and what we were asking. We said things like, when you do your onboarding paperwork, you might see this. So when you're talking about this very strict prescriptive form that the government has given people to now complete, as an employer or a potential employer, you can actually put communication around it. You can't change the form itself, but you can start with, when you're applying, you may see this form. The information is important to us because we believe in diversity, or because we believe that disability makes our businesses better. And although it's required for the government, we also use this information to, create a better experience for our employees. We value your feedback. All of these sorts of messaging provides clarity on what this form is asking and why it's asking it. You want to be so consistent with this, not just the clarity, but the consistency of this communication. Our company is intentional and has specific efforts for this. We believe that employees are more productive when they can bring their full self to work. And if you have any questions, here's where you can ask those questions. Here's a dedicated email address or a phone number or whatever you can provide to people who have questions about that before or while they are completing the form. Even if you don't have that form, even if you are not a federal contractor, there are great ways to create these messaging and these messages and to have clear and consistent communication about wanting to know this information and why you want to know this information and what's in it for them and what's in it for you, what will happen to the information. These communications are incredibly important. I found that companies are still a little hesitant to talk about this a lot, but I found a great example, which is Microsoft. So I put on this screen a copy of their careers website. And we have the link on this screen. All of the links that I mentioned will be sent to you all in the email that comes with the replay. So if you want to, you don't have to scribble these down, but I know that they're also being put into the chat in case you want to cut and paste or you want to go to that site right now. Microsoft does a great job of talking about why and how they are employing people with disabilities and where that becomes important to them. EY is another company that does a really great job focusing around their employees with disabilities and creating wonderful communication tools. This on the screen right now, I have an image of the one of the brochures that they create. It's an internal document that just talks about how do you work with employees who have non-visible disabilities. It's a guide for the employees to become more disability friendly as colleagues. And I think it does a great job of for managers too, not just for the colleagues, of how to create the consistent component of your culture that says, we want to know if you have a disability. We want you, if you have a disability, to be comfortable disclosing that to us. We want to create a good workplace for you. So, sorry, I used the term weave before, but it's important if you weave this into other things. The more separate and different and special you make disability look, the less you are conveying a consistent message that this is about inclusion. So one of the more successful tactics I have seen companies use is that when they are updating employee benefits information and other employee information within their database, they just remind people that the disability question is there. They don't make it a special different time that people have to go into the database to complete information or to verify information. They just tuck it into everything else. Some of the companies that I worked with, when they really wanted to focus on veterans, they focused on veterans and people with disabilities and kind of tucked it all together into communication campaigns they had going on or events, other things that they were doing, highlighting their success in this area, their desire to be more successful in this area, and just didn't make it so different and special on its own. And I think that that's been a very successful tactic with these companies. We've seen actually increase in data of self-reports of their employees. Again, they're not hiring new people and they're not getting rid of old people, but the people that are there feel more comfortable providing this information. And those are actually for federal contractors, so they were in a tight spot, needing to get those numbers up anyway. So I think that the more you can do to be consistent with things, not make it special and different, but at the same time be clear in your messaging, the more likely you are to get success. Another way to do this is to collaborate with the disability community. So if you have an employee resource group or any of the things that are happening internally with your employees that are around disability, to engage with that group and get them to help getting the word out, as well as to advise about ways to encourage people to disclose their disabilities and why people would want to, and how to create a more disability-friendly culture within your company. Collaborations with people who actually have disabilities and are actually your employees, those are the experts. Those are the ones who can really tell you how to shift things, how to do things differently so that you can get better outcomes along this dimension. In addition to just leveraging your employee resource group because it's a good idea, we see all the time when companies try to do something specific to disability and they don't engage with disability stakeholders, they get kind of slapped. So the disability community as a whole has a phrase, nothing about us without us. And it's a very strong sense of identity and ownership that influences the disability community as a general group, as well as specifically people with disabilities, their opinion about things that are done for people with disabilities. And so actually today, unfortunately, I had a great example of that on my LinkedIn feed, people talking about the Helen Keller Barbie doll and how Mattel made the choice to alter how Helen Keller looks so that she looks more like everybody else. And they tried to keep the clothes very consistent with what they were trying to experience, trying to demonstrate and to try to allow as an awareness tool. But people who are blind and specifically people who have similar issues that Helen Keller had about her eyes and that they weren't symmetrical, noticed right away that the Barbie doll, the Helen Keller Barbie doll, did not look like what Helen Keller looked like. And so the discussion that's going on right now about this very specific topic, and it's not, they're not unique. I mean, Nike put out a shoe for people with mobility impairments and they got slammed by some of their marketing tactics related to that by the disability community. And it really comes from a lack of understanding. You're trying to do the right thing for the disability community as a whole, but if you don't really engage with people who have the specific kinds of disabilities that you are targeting, you're going to be very challenged. And so one of the comments that was put out there was that Mattel created this Barbie doll for sighted people. And although maybe that was one of their motivations, they wanted to encourage people to understand this great leader, Helen Keller, and what she accomplished, and have a better impression of people who are deaf and blind. They missed the mark. And so again, nothing about us without us. Engaging with the disability community is definitely the right way to go and the right way to do things. So if it can be challenging if you don't have employees with disabilities or if you haven't created the culture yet, you can guess and you can try, and you just got to keep trying to have clear communication about why you want that. And as soon as you have an employee who's identifying that they have a disability, ask them if they want to give you some feedback and some pointers on how to do this better. You can't require them to do that. Some people with disabilities are very tired of being the token person with a disability. And keep in mind that just because a person has one kind of disability, it doesn't mean that they necessarily know anything about people with other kinds of disabilities, but it can be a place to start. And it can be a way to ensure that you're engaging with people with disabilities because what you're trying to do is something about them. And so you want to engage with them. Finally, I think it's important that you build comfort and confidence within your general workforce. I talked about this a little bit already. When somebody discloses that they have a disability, say, or they have a child with a disability, the reaction of the person who's receiving that information really is a very special, and I mean that somewhat in a negative way, opportunity. Um, I know that in the past, I've not been that open and offering as much empathy as I should have been to somebody who said they had some kind of disability that was different than mine. Um, I'm a cynical person, so that's how that comes out. But I also didn't work for any companies that really encouraged that within the culture where in the workplace I was in. If I was in a distribution center or in one of the stores running the training programs for people with disabilities, I felt very different about my response. But when I was in some of the less friendly areas of the company, or in some of the other companies I've worked in since then that have a long way to go on their cultures, I didn't always feel like I needed to be demonstrating a really warm and positive response to somebody saying, hey, I have a disability, or I just found out I have a disability, or I just found out my daughter has a disability. Those are all very emotion driven opportunities. And for people who are concerned or afraid or don't have a positive impression of people with disabilities, you can get a very negative response, and that will shut down the employee with a disability. So I think EY is the best example of this, what they've put out for their employees as resources so that they can understand how to be more receptive, how to answer in a more welcoming way when somebody says, or respond when somebody says, I have a disability, or I found out my daughter has a disability. And you don't have to have a pre-programmed, oh, I know exactly what to say script, but it's more about just having some ways to save space for the person that's disclosing, offer them grace during the time that they're learning how to experience it or deal with it, or just be used to saying it out loud. Those are all things that I think are really important for employers to think about when they're thinking about self-identification and disability disclosure. Keep in mind, 20% of the population in the US has a disability. So if you are thinking these are topics that don't require a lot of effort on your part, or are frivolous, or don't need to be focused on, well, you're probably not watching this webinar, but you're missing out on a very large portion of people with disabilities. And when we're talking about people with disabilities, either as your current employees or as your future employees, it's important to remember that not every disability is visible. So although the international symbol for disability is a person in a wheelchair, that's a very small percentage of people with disabilities as a whole. And so keeping in mind that when we're talking about people with disabilities and the potential workforce or the workforce you've got, we're talking about 328 million people in the US. 20% of them is 65 million people. And right now we're all in a labor crunch. So any one of those 65 million people you can get is great. Well, 48,750,000, yes, I did the math, of them, you can't see their disability. So the only way to convey to them that you are disability friendly is by messaging out to everybody how disability inclusive you are, and making sure that you have that clarity, the compassion, the collaboration with the disability community, providing consistent communication about your desire to know who has a disability so they feel comfortable bringing themselves to work, and they can provide the contributions and benefits that your company is looking for in a disability inclusive workplace. So I wanted to touch on real quickly, this is part of a webinar series. So this webinar is the 6th one. We're halfway through now. The first 3 were really about strategies that companies can use, talking about the why, the what, and the how of employing people with disabilities. And then this past quarter, we've been focusing on these 3 specific topics: disability etiquette and interactions, reasonable accommodations, and how to tell, this one, how to tell if a person has a disability. Because those are just 3 unique and separate topics that tend to be tripping points for companies that are looking to employ more people with disabilities. Each one of these webinars has to be registered for separately. I apologize for that. That's my inability to manage tech. So please know that the listing of all the webinars is on the link that I believe Lisa just popped into the chat. And you can go there and see all of them. For those that have already passed, you can download the replay of all of those, so that you can gain that, or you can binge them all in one night if you want to watch and listen that and hear what people's questions were, and be able to gather the information. The ones that are coming up, I wanted to spend a moment talking about. I couldn't divide them into 2 even groups, so I apologize for all those who were looking for symmetry in your lives. But July, August, and September, and October are all very much about sourcing and managing people with disabilities. We're going to dive deep into 4 topics. One is the keys to sourcing and hiring. The second one is creating partnerships for sourcing. The third one is the secrets to inclusive management. That one's been fun to create. And then finally, talking about disability inclusive performance management. That is a question I get all the time. Can I fire a person with a disability? And yes, you can. Or you can manage them, you can coach them, all those sorts of things. But somehow disability becomes this very special idea and concept across managers. And so we're going to be diving deep into that, specifically about managing and getting performance out of people with disabilities. And then the last 2, just to wrap up the year, will be growing a disability inclusive culture. How do you do it once you've got all that sourcing done? How do you do it? And then how to refresh, because a lot of companies have started disability inclusion hiring initiatives in the past. And maybe they've been going for a while and realizing, oh, we might need to have a little bit of a tweak to this. We might need to adjust it a little bit, or refresh it, so that we can have it be as exciting and new as it was when we started. So those are the topics. Again, you need to register for each one separately, but you can do it all from the same that same web page. And now I am going to open it up to questions. As I said, I'll be sending you the replay. As somebody who has processing issues, I always want to tell people, if you don't have a question right now, that's okay. You can always email me the question later. Or if 2 weeks from now, you're like, I wanted to ask that question. It just occurred to me I should ask that question. You can always email me to ask the question and put it out there. But I will open it up and let Lisa let me know if there's anything in the chat.
Absolutely. So I do encourage, if you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand and you can ask them verbally. If you'd prefer to put them in the chat, go ahead. I am monitoring it. And just a special thank you guys for joining us today.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. I will give a little space in case anybody wants to type in to the chat. So I'll just vamp here for the second and say that I really appreciate people coming today. This is a very unique topic that I didn't expect a lot of attention for or interest, but when people get down the road of thinking about sourcing, that's when they start to ask this question. And so I wanted it to be ready in the replay for people to be able to leverage when it's appropriate for their time to want to know more about self-ID and disability disclosure. And it is a very tricky topic. I did not touch on how to coach somebody to disclose a disability, because that in itself is a separate webinar. And I know that the Job Accommodation Network and several other disability groups do some wonderful webinars and have some white papers out there, as well as some guides on how to coach somebody when they're thinking about disclosing and whether or how they're going to do so. So I think that that's a better way to find that kind of information is from other folks versus me. I can only speak from my own experience, and that's every day it feels a little different. So to get it from those other experts is probably a better idea. I don't see anything else in the chat. Lisa, do you see anything else in the chat?
I have one question in private chat.
Great.
How do you approach someone who may have already disclosed their disability about being on a disability inclusion committee?
Oh, that's a good one. And it's a tough one. So when I work with companies and they're starting an employee resource group or a disability inclusion committee or anything like that, where you're looking for that representation of people with disabilities, the first thing you want to do is go to your employee database and say, well, who has a disability here? And let's, send them an email and invite them. And you can't do that. And that's frustrating, but that data is very, very confidential. And people rely on that confidentiality about it. So to get a person with a disability to join one of these groups, you have to communicate to everybody. And you have to say, we are especially looking for people who have direct experience with disability for themselves. But you also want to encourage people who have direct experience with a family member with a disability or have some other very close relationship to it, because their perspective can be equally as important with how to guide and provide feedback and information about disability within your workforce. Not sure if that answered your question, so I'll pause for a second and see if we're looking for another dimension of that.
That is great. Thank you so much.
Great. Wonderful. Appreciate you guys being here for the live presentation, your questions, your feedback. It's been a pleasure having you all here. Thank you. And thank you, Lisa, as always. Your participation, your help, and your enthusiasm is so valued. I really appreciate the partnership.
Thank you. We really appreciate it as well.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.